No one could handle the billionaire's daughter until Black Waitress did the impossible. What if the most challenging child you ever met wasn't acting out because she was spoiled, but because she was desperately trying to tell the world something no one was listening to hear? In the gleaming towers of downtown Chicago, where million-dollar deals happen over coffee and power lunches decide fortunes, there lived a man named James Crawford who had everything money could buy, except the one thing that mattered most. His 8-year-old daughter Sophia had become known throughout the city's elite circles as the impossible child. Nannies quit within days. Private tutors walked out mid-lesson. Even child psychologists threw up their hands in defeat. The little girl with curly brown hair and her father's piercing blue eyes had earned a reputation that preceded her wherever she went. But what they didn't know was that Sophia wasn't being difficult. She was being brilliant in a way that would soon change everything. Where are you watching from tonight? James Crawford had built his financial empire from nothing, turning a small investment firm into one of Chicago's most respected wealth management companies. At 42, he commanded boardrooms with the same intensity he'd once used to study for his economics degree on scholarship. But all his success felt hollow when he watched his daughter struggle through another day. Sophia had been acting out ever since her mother passed away from cancer 2 years ago, and James felt helpless watching his brilliant little girl push away everyone who tried to help her. The penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan had become a revolving door of caregivers. Last week alone, 2 experienced nannies had quit. Mrs. Peterson, who'd worked with wealthy families for 30 years, lasted exactly 4 days. "She's too smart for her own good," she'd said, shaking her head as she packed her bags. James wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Sophia did see through people, their impatience, their judgment, their quiet assumption that money could solve everything. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when James received yet another call from Sophia's exclusive private school. "Mr. Crawford, I'm afraid we need to discuss Sophia's behavior again." Principal Morrison's voice carried that familiar tone of polite exhaustion. James closed his eyes, recognizing his own stubbornness in his daughter's words. That afternoon, James found himself sitting in his car outside Maple Street Diner, a modest little restaurant he'd never noticed despite driving past it for years. His executive assistant had suggested meeting there instead of his usual upscale spots, claiming they needed somewhere quiet to discuss finding yet another caregiver for Sophia. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who could afford any restaurant in the city, preparing to eat in a place that probably cost less for a full meal than he typically spent on a single glass of wine. As he walked through the diner's front door, James felt oddly out of place in his tailored suit among the working-class customers. The smell of fresh coffee and home-cooked food filled the air, so different from the sterile elegance of his usual haunts. He chose a corner booth, hoping to conduct his business quietly, but something about the warm atmosphere made him pause. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about stock portfolios or quarterly reports. A woman approached his table with a gentle smile that reached her eyes. She moved with quiet confidence, her natural hair pulled back neatly, wearing a simple uniform that somehow looked dignified on her. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. "I'm Jasmine, and I'll be taking care of you today." There was something in her voice, a genuine kindness that made James look up from his phone for the first time all day. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything for both him and Sophia. Over the next hour, as James waited for his assistant, who never showed up due to traffic, he found himself observing Jasmine as she worked. She moved through the diner with remarkable grace, treating every customer, from the construction workers grabbing lunch to the elderly couple sharing pie, with the same genuine warmth. What struck him most was how she handled a difficult situation at the neighboring table, where a frustrated businessman was berating her about a delayed order. Instead of becoming defensive, Jasmine listened carefully, acknowledged his concerns, and somehow turned his anger into understanding with just a few calm words. "You're good at that," James found himself saying when she refilled his coffee. Jasmine looked puzzled. "At handling difficult people," he clarified. She smiled softly. "I do. A 10-year-old son named Marcus." Her words hit James like a revelation. James felt his chest tighten. Without meaning to, he found himself telling this stranger about Sophia, about the endless parade of failed caregivers, about feeling like he was failing the most important person in his life. Jasmine listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking gentle questions that showed she truly understood. "It sounds like she's protecting herself," Jasmine said finally. "Smart kids who've been hurt learn to test people right away." The conversation was interrupted by James's phone buzzing with urgent business calls, but something had shifted. For the first time since his wife died, James felt like someone understood what he and Sophia were going through. As he reluctantly prepared to leave, Jasmine handed him his check with a small note written on a napkin. "Children don't need perfect parents." That evening, James tried a different approach with Sophia. Instead of asking about her day or trying to fix her problems, he simply sat beside her as she worked on an advanced chemistry set, far beyond what most 8-year-olds could handle. He asked quietly. Sophia looked at him suspiciously, waiting for the catch, but when none came, she began explaining the molecular structures with the passion of a true scientist. For 20 minutes, they worked side by side in comfortable silence, and James realized his daughter wasn't difficult, she was extraordinary. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. But their peaceful evening was shattered by a phone call from the school. The principal was threatening suspension, and James felt his old frustration returning. As he drove to the school, he found himself wondering if Jasmine's kindness could somehow extend to the impossible challenge that was his brilliant, heartbroken daughter. James arrived at the school to find complete chaos. Teachers stood helplessly outside the locked science lab while Sophia's voice came through the door, calmly reciting the periodic table in what sounded like an act of defiance. Principal Morrison approached James with barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Crawford, this behavior is becoming unacceptable." Through the door, James could hear his daughter's small voice growing shaky as she reached the heavier elements, and he realized she wasn't being defiant, she was scared. "Sophia," he called gently through the door. "It's Dad." There was a long silence before her voice came back, smaller now. "They said I was showing off again." Mrs. James's heart broke a little. His brilliant daughter was being punished for her intelligence, made to feel ashamed of the very gifts that made her special. That night, after finally coaxing Sophia out with promises that he wouldn't let anyone make her feel bad for being smart, James found himself back at Maple Street Diner. He hadn't planned to return, but something drew him to the one place where he'd felt understood. Jasmine was working the evening shift, and her face lit up with recognition when she saw him. She asked, and somehow, James found himself telling her everything about the school incident, about feeling like he was failing his daughter, about not knowing how to help a child whose intelligence intimidated even adults. Jasmine listened with the same patient attention she had shown before. But this time James noticed something else in her eyes, a deep understanding that went beyond sympathy. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I mentioned my son Marcus, but I didn't tell you that he's gifted too. Not in the same way as your daughter, but smart enough that school has been a real challenge." The conversation continued as the dinner crowd thinned out, and James found himself sharing memories of his late wife, how she'd been the one who truly understood Sophia's unique mind. She used to say that Sophia wasn't challenging. She was just waiting for the world to catch up to her, he said softly. Jasmine nodded knowingly. Sounds like she was right. Have you ever faced something like this with a child? Let us know in the comments. As James prepared to leave, Jasmine surprised him with an unexpected offer. "I don't usually do this," she said carefully, "but if you ever need someone to watch Sophia, just occasionally, maybe after school, I might be able to help." James looked at her in surprise. After all the professional nannies and trained caregivers who'd failed, this kind waitress was offering to help? The next afternoon, James found himself standing outside Maple Street Diner, with Sophia's hand clasped tightly in his. Her blunt honesty made James smile, despite his nervousness. Jasmine greeted them both warmly, and James watched as she knelt down to Sophia's eye level, something most adults never bothered to do. "So your dad tells me you're really interested in science," Jasmine said simply. "I've been wondering about something. Do you think you could teach me why leaves change colors?" For the first time in weeks, James saw genuine curiosity spark in his daughter's eyes instead of the defensive wariness that had become her default expression. What happened next was remarkable. Sophia began explaining photosynthesis and chlorophyll breakdown with the enthusiasm she usually reserved for her chemistry set, and Jasmine listened with such genuine interest that Sophia's explanations became more animated, more detailed. She wasn't showing off. She was sharing something she loved with someone who truly wanted to understand. James watched in amazement as his daughter, who had terrorized trained professionals, opened up completely to this kind woman who simply treated her intelligence as a gift rather than a problem. As the afternoon progressed, Jasmine suggested they walk to the small park behind the diner. She brought along a notebook and asked Sophia to draw diagrams of what she'd been explaining, then helped her create an entire illustrated guide to autumn science. Jasmine said as Sophia finished her drawings, "I bet there are other kids who would love to learn about this stuff." Sophia's eyes widened. The idea that her knowledge could help others instead of making them feel stupid was revolutionary to her. When James's phone buzzed with the usual work crisis, he expected the familiar routine, his attention divided, Sophia acting out, the caregiver becoming frustrated. Instead, Jasmine simply said, "Take your call." For 20 minutes, James handled his business while watching through the window as his daughter laughed and learned with someone who genuinely enjoyed her company. The real breakthrough came when Sophia mentioned missing her mother. Instead of changing the subject or offering empty comfort, Jasmine said quietly, "Tell me about her." For the first time since the funeral, Sophia talked about her mother, about their science experiments together, about how her mom had always said being smart was a superpower, not a burden. Jasmine listened to every word, and James saw his daughter's shoulders relax in a way they hadn't in 2 years. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. As the sun began to set, Jasmine walked them back to James's car. She asked Sophia, who nodded eagerly. James realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, not just childcare, but genuine connection, the kind his daughter had been desperately seeking all along. 6 months later, James stood in the back of Sophia's classroom, watching his daughter present her science project to a group of fascinated third graders. The impossible child who had once terrorized teachers was now patiently explaining molecular structure to her classmates, using the teaching techniques Jasmine had shown her. The transformation wasn't magic. It was simply what happened when someone saw Sophia's brilliance as a gift to be nurtured rather than a problem to be solved. Jasmine sat in the front row, beaming with pride as if Sophia were her own daughter. Over the past months, she'd become much more than a caregiver. She was the person who helped Sophia channel her intelligence into helping others, who taught her that being different wasn't something to hide. Under Jasmine's patient guidance, Sophia had started a science club at school, mentoring younger children who struggled with math and science. The girl who once felt isolated by her intelligence now used it to build bridges with others. The changes in their family had been remarkable. James had learned to see his daughter through Jasmine's eyes, not as a challenge to be managed, but as an extraordinary person to be celebrated. Family dinners that had once been tense affairs, filled with homework battles, were now animated discussions about discoveries and experiments. Sophia would excitedly share what she'd learned, and James would listen with the same genuine interest Jasmine had modeled for him. Most importantly, Sophia had begun to heal from losing her mother. With Jasmine's gentle encouragement, she'd started talking about her memories freely, celebrating her mother's love for science instead of feeling abandoned by her loss. "Mum would love that you're teaching other kids," Jasmine had told her one afternoon. Those words had lifted a weight from Sophia's heart that she'd been carrying for 2 years. She smiled and shook her head, gesturing toward Sophia. They both knew the truth. Sophia hadn't needed fixing. She'd simply needed someone who understood that the brightest lights sometimes shine differently, and that different could be beautiful. That evening, as they walked through the same park where Sophia had first explained photosynthesis, James reflected on how much their lives had changed. His daughter skipped ahead, pointing out various plants and explaining their characteristics to Jasmine's son, Marcus, who had become like a big brother to her. The impossible child had become an inspiring teacher. The frustrated father had learned to see wonder through his daughter's eyes, and the kind waitress had shown them both that sometimes the most extraordinary solutions come from the simplest acts of understanding. Sophia ran back to them, her face glowing with happiness. She asked, clutching a handful of maple seeds she'd collected. James smiled, knowing that his daughter was one of those seeds, finally given the right conditions to flourish. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful journey of discovery, patience, and the power of seeing others through eyes of love.